much. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real honor to be here. We're going to get this technology working here in a second. I have to start off with an apology, and I'll just give you a little foreshadowing. First three slides are going to be an apology, an equivocation, and a bunch of caveats. So you're in for a wild ride. Hang on. So yeah, so the apology is, when Ken asked me to if I wanted to do this, sent me a link, said, hey, check out the previous stuff so you know what you're signing up for. I looked at the link, website, okay, photo, bio, link to the video of the talk. Sounds great. Yeah, okay, let's do it, Ken. So imagine my horror when, as a reformed introvert, when I walk in to meet with our senior design team, Team 11 here this semester, and see a giant portrait of myself in the EB2 lobby, and extend that horror out to it with the growing realization that it's basically hanging on every vertical surface throughout the building. So apologies for having to spend about a month looking at my mug. So yeah, as was said earlier, my name's Devin. I help lead the data science team at Advanced Auto Parts. It's a very new team. But I've been with them just over a year now. But basically my whole career, I've been inside of large organizations. Always been passionate about trying new things, about innovation. I grew into technology about sort of midway through my career. I actually started in linguistics. So sort of had a passion for foreign languages, thought I wanted to be sort of an interpreter, and came into technology much later, really through just being fed up with not being able to actually solve my own problems, do anything with a computer. As I said, I sort of garnered this reputation for myself as an innovator. I will equivocate, here it comes, a little bit on the troublemaker. I mean, that's really sort of a reflection of the learning process that I went through throughout my career and continue to go through, and just having an abundance of sort of organizational friction and sort of not knowing how to express myself in a context that would be understood by people throughout, a broad spectrum of people throughout the organization. Proposing ideas that clash with strategic direction. I mean, all the terrible, a lot of bad ideas, but I sort of figured things out. I think at one point I received a cease and desist letter from someone inside my own organization, although I did end up winning a national award for that project. So, I don't know if there's a lesson there or not. And so here's the caveats, right? So again, this roller coaster's off to a start. So this is not research. This is just my observations throughout my career. Not authoritative. It's not the opinions of my current or any of my former employers. I welcome any sort of disagreement or dissension or questions. Although normally I would take questions throughout, but I think in this case I might be able to do them at the end, and hopefully we'll leave time for them, depending on how things go. So I think it's important to just sort of get this out of the way, that sort of this baseline assumption that we think that innovation is important, sort of fundamentally important for growth and moving forward and exploring new ideas. If you're really stuck on the idea that computer science peaked at the 286 mainframe and everything else has just been a waste of time, this probably isn't the talk for you. And specifically the context is going to be inside of large organizations. I might reference startups or smaller companies. I don't have a lot of experience there, so I'll try and keep that limited. When I'm talking about, if I'm using broad statements, I'm really talking about again, inside of sort of big organizations. It's probably even worth defining that a little bit. I'm really talking about, big, right? 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 plus employee organizations, right? Big ones. If you actually want to read some well-researched and properly sourced and cited content on innovation, I would highly recommend these two. They're particularly relevant to sort of the topics that we'll be discussing today. First one is Rebels at Work. Probably maybe my just favorite book on innovation. There's a lot of them out there, a lot of books on innovation out there. Probably my favorite. If you read nothing else out of it, there's a section on rebel self-care that is just cannot be missed. Innovator's Dilemma, I like this because it sort of explains, from the perspective of the innovator, right? I like Innovator's Dilemma because it sort of explains the somewhat counterintuitive nature. It helps answer the question of why do large corporations sort of behave this way when it comes to new ideas? So I find that very, very helpful as foundational understanding. And so sort of structured the talk this way. I don't know. It's probably better ways to do it. Broken into 4 chunks. I put them in linear order because even in 2019, slideshows continue to be sort of serial beasts, right? But it's sort of a spectrum and not even really a spectrum, more of a big mishmash, right? We can focus on these topics, but know that they sort of interweave with one another and blend. Trying to draw a hard line is probably a mistake, which I've obviously made in preparation for this evening. But these are sort of the main things that we're going to be talking about. So we want to sort of build an understanding for large organizations and sort of how they operate, why they operate that way. We want to sort of build an empathy for the people, because organizations are made out of people, right? And we want to sort of build an empathy for the people involved, because you're going to have to deal with them. Sorry to break it to the computer scientists, but you're going to have to talk to people. Sort of some tips on how to actually get up and running and be able to take some action. And then, really one of the important parts is how to do so with impact. And we'll talk about specific strategies that I've found is useful for taking impact, thinking about where to find opportunities and whatnot. So let's start with the understanding. So, okay, big monolithic corporations, right? They're massive beasts. They're everywhere. They do everything. Lots of employees, all sort of churning away. From an innovator's perspective, someone who's sort of passionate about trying new things, this can be a very scary place. There's a whole lot of business as usual. It's probably been there for a very long time. In some cases, years, some cases, decades. So from someone trying to introduce and passionate about introducing new ideas into that space, it can be frustrating. And so what we're going to do here is just sort of hopefully build a little intuition for some of the underlying factors. So here's a quote from everyone for all time. Is this question of why is this so hard, right? And clearly there's no one answer, right? Because if there was, we probably would have figured it out by now, right? And that would just be how do you do innovation? Here's how you do innovation right here. Just read the book. There you go. Nobody's come out with that book, although they claim to. Usually to sell the book. But this question keeps coming up. So this must be quite complex, even though it looks simple on the surface. There must be a whole lot of factors and context that go into answering it. And the answer is probably not the same for each organization, for each person. So one of the big things inside of a large organization is a strong support for the status quo. We can sort of think about sort of how the business is structured and managed across sort of the 3 Ps, right? So make sure I get them in the order I actually put them on the slide. Okay, so product, so whatever the organization produces, whether it's a service or a good, whatever that is, it's meeting customer demands, right? They're making money. It's selling, right? Yeah, maybe sales could be better. Maybe maybe there's room for improvement, but they're making money, and in some cases they're making a lot of money, right? The processes have been honed, not to necessarily imply efficiency, but they've been honed and changed and adapted over sort of multiple business cycles, multiple generations. There's reasons behind each of those changes. And again, these processes have been in place for years or even decades. And then finally, the people. Pretty much, if you're new to a large organization, everyone who's not in sort of your onboarding class with you has probably gotten to where they're at based off the way things currently work, right? They've been rewarded for that, they've been promoted for that. And so it's really important to keep that in mind as we look for places to have an impact, right? I sort of touched on this already a little bit, but you don't get to be a multi-billion-dollar corporation without getting some things right, and finding a niche in the market, knock stuff over, and being able to produce, answer market demand, right? Sell goods or services for more than it costs you, right? Like you're a money-making machine if you're that large, and so the result is that new ideas can be sort of subjected to this lopsided and maybe even called unfair risk versus reward sort of calculus, right? And so if we could sort of think of this like if you're on a diminishing returns curve, right? Something normal. And if you're in the startup world, you're here, right? You're like, we're going to go make $40 million. We just got to figure out how to deploy this new idea and get it to market, right? Because you got this whole curve, ahead of you that is showing up. Oh, good. I should have checked that before I started referencing it. But if you're inside a large organization, you're sort of like way up here, right? You've sort of had your hit. You were a startup a long time ago, right? Like you were a small business, right? You were pressing your greenfield advantage 40, 50 years ago, maybe, right? Like now it's all about marginal growth. Now, because of the numbers we're dealing with, 1% gains are still very large numbers, right? But you're way up on this curve, right? And because of the nature of this curve, and granted, I'm doing a lot of hand waving, literally and figuratively, but hopefully you get the idea, right? And because of the shape of the curve, it's always going to be, one step in to the left is always going to be a bigger drop than one step to the right will be a gain, right? Because of the nature of the slope of the curve, right? And so from the organization's perspective, right, it's much worse to risk one step backwards, even if it means not taking one step forward, right? Because again, we're making money. Oh, this one. This took me a long time to learn and a long time to adapt to. That's a joke, by the way. It's not actually my law. Can it be? Academics? How do we do that? Okay, let's circle back later and figure out how to make that happen. Here's the thing about large organizations, I mean really big ones, right, is that they sort of do everything. Everything that they've already decided is in their universe, somebody's in charge of. Somebody somewhere in the giant tree org chart is already in charge of that. That's their job. They may not actually do it, but it is their domain, right? In the startup world, you probably have, small businesses, there's things that you understand you might get to eventually, right? But you're not going to worry about right now, right? Like payroll, yeah, okay, we'll do payroll at some point, but right now we got to get this server stood up, right? It's totally different in a large organization, and what this means is wherever you want to go, you're going to be have already been assigned to a role, right? There's a high barrier to sort of exit that role, right? And to go and sort of play in anybody else's sandbox. Does that make sense? Because again, from a bureaucratic perspective, from an organizational perspective, they think they have it all covered. So at this point, I've painted a pretty dour picture of large organizations. If you're someone who prides themselves on sort of coming up with new ideas and innovating, you might be asking yourself, why even bother? Probably a fair question at this point. So let's endeavor to answer that. And there really are some upsides, significant upsides to working in large organizations that I've found. right? Because of that broad scope that we just talked about, that sort of all-encompassing spread, there are opportunities everywhere. Because obviously, even though they say they cover everything, you can't possibly actually do everything, right? Which means there's opportunities everywhere, and someone already built in who's going to care about those opportunities, right? Which is exciting. There's also significant resources available. If you're able to sort of motivate some movement, they can bring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars in investment to bear very quickly, right? To move ideas forward. And again, the potential for impact, because of the size of the organizations, can tend to be very large. Again, sort of mentioned earlier, if you have a 1% gain on a $10 billion company is a whole heck of a lot of money, right? Not that money's everything. So moving to sort of our next section, want to talk about, again, organizations are made up of individuals. I think it's really important to sort of always keep that in mind and be able to separate the two, because you can get very frustrated with the way the organization works. You have to take it out on are the people that work there, right? Which I would not recommend. So hopefully through building a little empathy and a little understanding for their own motivations, we can avoid some of that, and instead of working at odds with them, we can learn how to work with them. So, yeah, I mean, at the most fundamental level, right? Like, remember that they're people too. They're rational actors. They have their own. We sort of talked about the organizational risk versus reward. It's probably not all that different if you're talking with someone who's been maybe in a position for 10 or 20 years, the same organization, maybe even in the same or similar role. Their appetite for risk may not be the same as you, the recent college graduate with all the cutting edge technical skills. When you start talking to them about your ideas, it may be very scary, maybe very confusing. Knowing that you can have that effect, I think, is important going in to try and avoid it. Because ultimately you sort of end up, right, again, we sort of talked about in the organizational context, the sort of inherent understanding that innovation is important. At an intellectual level, the individuals you'll be dealing with, they understand that too. But again, they're held accountable for business the way it's currently done, right? What we call KPIs, or the metrics of success, that they're held to are based off of business as usual, right? Taking a step in a different direction puts that at risk, because what you're asking them to do is something that's fundamentally unfamiliar to them. So let's go through a little exercise. First time trying this idea out on a large audience, which is the perfect time to do it. So let's go. So if we look at this scene here, if I asked you to tell me, how far is it to the edge of the street, you could do that pretty easily, right? Because we see a trash can, we're familiar with trash cans, we know about how high it is. We see a person, okay, we can probably make some good guesses about how tall they are, right? So the person's about 6 foot, so standing next to a light pole, it's maybe 12 feet. We understand what's going on in the scene. We can sort of even use that to maybe extrapolate how wide is the street. We have some good perspective here, so we can tell very easily and very quickly which buildings are further away from us, which buildings are closer to us, as well as have at least some sense of the relative distance between the buildings. How much further away is the third one on the left from the one closest to us? Begin to notice, right, the phenomenon that as you really go far down the street, our ability to sort of calculate these same factors begins to diminish. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so now we're going to expand the scale, right? So it's like, okay, well, what do we have that we understand that we're familiar with? All right, I see a road down there. Maybe I could estimate. I could say, okay, I roughly can guess it's probably a 2-lane road. Probably have some guess about how wide that might be. Maybe I could use that. I see a bunch of trees here in the foreground, although that's still quite a distance away. Maybe I could use that to guess how tall the trees are. As we continue to move back, again, I'm still able to tell what's further away and what's closer to me for the most part. But you really start to lose detail and clarity as you go. And anybody know what's on the other side of the mountain? No, of course not, right? Like we have no idea what's out there. It could be more mountains. It could be a city like we just saw. It could be anything. Okay, now let's really stretch it out, right? Now it's, which, can anybody tell me, which is closer, this one or this one, right? Like, no, of course not, right? Like, there's probably a difference in those distances. There's probably a massive difference in those distances, and we have zero ability to tell them apart. Maybe the one on the left is a planet, and the other one is, a blue supergiant. Those are wildly different things, and yet to us at this distance, at this perspective, we really can't tell them apart. Cool? All right. And so we can sort of also we can then model this sort of phenomenon, right? And I think use it to explain a lot of the discomfort and fear around new ideas. It's basically the same sort of distance idea, right? Is that the things that are close to us, we're comfortable with. We have that sort of intuition for like, okay, I get a sense of what might be involved in a task that's firmly in sort of the easy side of the spectrum, right? I can break down the components fairly well, right? Whatever it is, and I can probably give you an estimate of how long that task might take me, right? If you give me something sort of in the hard spectrum, like I might have to think about it a bit more, might not be able to answer all the questions until I solve some initial problems, right? Like in project management, you might call this like the cone of uncertainty, right? Like, well, I know what I can do today. I'm pretty sure I know what I can do by the end of the week. As to what we can accomplish in 3 months, let me get back to you, right? But then all the way on the far right, like you're over the horizon, right? There's this end of the spectrum where people just have no idea, no reference, right? They're way out of their depth. And particularly as technologists, in large organizations, usually full of not technologists, right? And so you're going to have conversations with people and you're going to explain things that are in your green zone and their red zone, right? You're like, yeah, no, we'll just go on to AWS. We'll just spin up a cluster, right? We'll just pull down a couple terabytes of data from S3, right? We'll get cranking on this, no problem, right? That they have no frame of reference for what you're talking about, right? Like you're often in impossible land for them, right? So having that empathy and understanding the impact that your knowledge can have, I think is very important. I'd encourage you to keep this model in mind. I think it applies. Well, it's very general, so it applies all over the place, right? There's 3 components to it, so. Okay, so enough about empathy. Let's talk about actually like doing something. Let's take some action. So the single most important thing, I think when it comes to action is you're gonna have to find something that inspires you, right? Something about the organization, and again, the benefit is the organization does a lot of things. It's very large. There may be opportunities all over the place. You need to find something that you can really get passionate about. What the organization does, the customers that they serve. Maybe it's just helping people, right? We've got a whole crew on our e-commerce team that just love to build stuff. Right, like give them a halfway decent problem and then just let them loose, right? And they just love to build. You've got to find that spark, because this is not going to be an easy road. Sorry, like it's just not. You're going to have to sort of grind it out. There's going to be times when it's really hard. There's going to be times when you think the idea is done. So you're going to have something that can really sort of pull you through and across the finish line. Plus, it gives you something to talk about, right? Some reason for trying so hard, right? And I think we'll touch on this a little bit later, but that's an important part of sort of telling the story about your innovation. Second thing, make friends, right? Remember that little spectrum we looked at? Yeah, it applies to you too. Like, sorry to break it to you, right? Like, no matter how many things are in your green area, no matter how many topics you could teach right now if you had to, there are many more in the red space, right? That's just how it is, right? And when you're entering into a business, a very large business that does maybe a lot of things and maybe has been doing those things for a very long time, there's going to be a lot of things that you really need to know that are still in your red space, right? So the best way to sort of get at that is to make friends. A little bit of a secret just between you guys, me, and all of YouTube later. For a data scientist, I'm pretty bad at math, right? But I have some friends that are amazing at it, and we just make a great team, right? So being able to build a team is really at the crux of this. Being able to build a team that can complement one another, that can cover each other, right? You want the things in your red zone to be the things in their green zone, right? That's the ideal situation. Being able to do this will take you very far. The other two things, storytelling and prototyping. These are incredibly powerful, and the better you get at them, the more impactful you'll be, the more success you'll have as an innovator. So for storytelling, you really have to have a vision. And think back to the inspiration slide. To have some reason why this new idea is so important, right? Because remember, new ideas represent risk, right? So you have to have something, right, that's going to inspire people to take a chance on you, right? And to take a chance on your idea. You really need to get good at talking about it in a compelling way. Again, leveraging that vision, at least as a kernel, right? And you need to be able to talk about it. You guys heard of the elevator pitch? We were just working on this with Team 11. The elevator pitch, like the 1 minute, like end-to-end spiel, right? So if you get stuck in the elevator with the CEO, right, like going from 1 to 21, right, like you can give them the whole thing, as well as be prepared to have long, in-depth conversations about what it is, what you're trying to do, be able to talk about what the risks are, what the benefits are. You need to be able to talk about all those things, and really, because again, there's a risk calculus. You can get their attention with something sort of human and impassioned, but you're really going to need to sell it to them on a business side with something that makes sense to them, right? That they can that makes their lives easier, that improves. You want to build a sandcastle in my sandbox. You better tell me why this is going to make my life better, right? Prototyping is this other thing, right? You make it real. You take something from the abstract and you put it in front of people, and you let them touch it or see it or whatever the case may be. It allows you to demonstrate value quickly, even at just the proof of concept level. It builds trust that, like, okay, all right, like I still don't really understand this whole cloud thing, but clearly he's doing something and he's getting back the right answer. Okay, all right. And again, it can sort of act like a map for that the distance on the other side of the mountain, right? Like I still don't know what's out there. I still have never been there. I don't have much reference for it. But if you can give me a map of what's out there and sort of walk me through it, I'm going to be a whole lot more comfortable. Make sense? Everybody with me? All right. This model's doing okay. All right, I'm happy. God, I love this picture. Let's talk about impact, right? So it's one thing to like do stuff. We want to actually like get stuff done. More so than like the kid, face planting on the sofa while his parents talk to the president. But yeah. So we talked before about a breadth of opportunities that tend to exist inside of large organizations, and here's where we're going to begin to unpack that a little bit. Two main areas that we're going to really explore are gaps and inefficiencies. The good news is you should find them everywhere inside of large organizations. I used to be in the Army. It'd be what we call a target-rich environment. So, all right, let's talk about gaps first. We're going to just take gaps. We'll talk about inefficiencies here in a second. Let's just talk about gaps, right? I would propose one way of thinking about them would be using sort of a 2x2 like this, right? So we sort of put, know-how on the horizontal and sort of awareness on the vertical, right? And so, whatever problem it is, whatever solution it is you're trying to work with, right? You can probably sort of map it somewhere on here, and that's going to, I think, give you some good insight into how you might want to approach your particular challenge, your particular innovation, right? So if you're in the upper left, right, where we know we have a problem, right? We know this is an issue, and we just don't know how to solve it. We don't know what to do about it, right? I've talked to many shops, many teams that have spent a lot of time, copying text from one electronic document to another electronic document, just because they're very aware that that's probably a terrible way of doing things, but it works. We're making money, and we don't know how. Nobody here has the skills to do it any way differently, right? So from a skills gap perspective, you can plug it yourself. Okay. You might also consider, this also opens up other opportunities that may even have a larger impact. Like, is it better to write them some Python code or maybe some VBA scripts? Or is it better to spend a couple lunch hours, over a couple of weeks teaching them VBA, right? Different approach, at least the same impact, if not greater, right? Sort of circling around clockwise, right? So we would be aware of a problem, and we know how to fix it. We're just not going to fix it, right? More of a priorities gap, right? These decisions, this is harder, right? This is harder to sort of get into from an innovation perspective. Again, because they're aware of it, they at least think they understand sort of what's involved, and they're making the deliberate decision not to address the problem. Now, it could be that their calculus is off because their information is old, because the last time they touched the technology, maybe it was a lot harder. We didn't have the tools that we have today. So there can be discussions there. Because, maybe it's a lot easier, it's a lot lower cost, and therefore it should be something that we should go ahead and tackle. Is it a requirements gap, right, where they know what needs to be done, the knowledge is there, right? So we have people who can do this, but nobody's asked us to do it, right? We need to get that. And so the way you might address that is like, well, there's already people who can do this inside the organization. Let's just help. My innovation is I'm going to grab the people in accounting and walk them over to IT, right? And say Ann in IT, this is Phil in accounting. Phil's going to tell you about a problem he's having, and why don't you put in a ticket on his behalf, and we'll get things rolling, right? And the last one, where you don't know how to do it, you don't even know what the problem is, the unknown. As an innovator, it's a lot more. This is a more attractive space, right? There's a lot of freedom to roam here. It's a little harder. Again, thinking back to sort of the theory the theory of bureaucratic completeness, right? Like, whatever solution you come up with, right? Whatever you say, actually we have a problem here that nobody's ever thought of before. Somebody owns that space, right? And so there can be some human factors in terms of how you couch that, how you talk about it, who you bring into your team. Those might be great people. The people in whose sandbox that falls might be great people to bring on board and to get on your side, right? So this, I encourage you to take this away and use this as a lens for evaluating opportunities that we would consider gaps. The other is inefficiencies. Is another big one. It's all over the place, right? First one's law. Not much you as an individual can do about this, but I would actually encourage you to get really familiar as time allows with the laws that govern whatever area you're in, whether it's business, or nonprofits, whatever it is. Get very comfortable with the law. Make friends with the lawyers. I've actually had great experience with lawyers, usually because they'll actually sit down and listen to like a well-reasoned argument, and then give a well-reasoned explanation as to why I'm wrong. I can work with that. Next is policy, right? So laws are written by lawmakers, right, and interpreted by lawyers. Policies are written by bureaucrats and interpreted by bureaucrats, right? To an innovator, they can feel like the same thing. They're just the rules, right? They're very different. They behave different. Breaking one might get you fired. Breaking the other might get you arrested, right? Like they're very different, and it's important, I think, to keep that in mind. Other sources of inefficiency are, maybe, hey, this technology we invested in 20 years ago and are still using, it leaves an opportunity for some sort of new idea, new innovation, new technology. Again, it was the right answer, was being the operative word, but maybe it's no longer today. And then this last one, it's hard to get upset with anybody over it. When you see it, you'll know what I mean. But never underestimate like the motivated yet unqualified individual, right? Like the people who, again, will like, you sit down and like, explain to me what you're doing here. It's like, right, I take this spreadsheet and I take these fields out of it and I filter it by this and then I copy it over to this text file, right? And then I take that and I bring in this other information, right? And you're just like, as someone who can code, right? You're like, oh my gosh, right? But they're just motivated people, right? They're passionate about what they're doing. They're passionate about the problems they're trying to solve, and they're just figuring it out. Those can be some of the most rewarding people to help. Usually because, again, they've gone to great lengths to solve their problems, excessive lengths in some cases. And so if you can come in and make their lives a whole lot easier, well, that's a great feeling. So that's another place to look. The other thing, if you want to have impact, is you got to engage the big machine, right? And what I mean are the big bureaucratic mechanisms that your organization is going to have, right? They're going to have, an IT group. They're going to have, right, that takes requirements, builds, maintains systems, understand how to leverage that, understand how to take your idea and feed it into that pipeline. You need to build support for your ideas across the business. Again, which means you're going to need to express it in a business context. Sort of already mentioned IT when I jumped ahead of myself. If you're lucky enough to be part of an organization with an internal innovation platform, leverage that, or at least know why you're not leveraging it and be able to talk about that in sort of a non-threatening way, because there are lots of organizations out there with these sorts of platforms. Some of them are not all that great, right? Some of them are just, a way, well, the impact of some of them is to simply sort of take new ideas in and then just crush them with process until there's just nothing left. Hopefully that's not it, but if it is, you should be able to talk about, again, in a diplomatic way, why you're not using that service, or even better, why you are using it, right? And actually be able to leverage that into some impactful innovation. So really, you're going to have to strike a balance, and speed is your friend. You really want to avoid getting bogged down. You're going to have to, and it's going to depend on the individual factors and your own tolerance for risk, not only with the technology you're dealing with, but with your own career. Everybody heard like it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, right? Because if I ask you permission, you tell me no, and I do it anyway. That's worse than if I didn't ask to begin with, and you catch me later. it's not always true, but you're gonna have to balance that, right? Like you can't. Well, one, at a practical, you can't ask everyone in a 70,000 person organization to sign off on your idea before you take step one, right? And so at some point you're gonna have to take your own initiative, but then also how far do you go? Do you take it to a prototype stage so that you actually have something tangible before you tell anybody about it? Which sort of feeds into the next one. Do you operate under the radar versus trying to get buy-in and support, or how fast do you want to move versus how many people do you want on board, right? And consensus. And really, sort of every time you're sort of you're making the choice to sort of operate without disclosing what you're doing, maybe fully, or when you choose speed over consensus, when you choose under the radar over buy-in, when you choose forgiveness over permission, you're sort of incurring what I would call sort of innovator's debt. It's not necessarily bad, right? Because some of those choices allow us to get going and allow us to build something that can actually blossom. But too much of it certainly is bad. Right, and so you're just going to have to strike a balance and keep an eye on where is my debt level? What are my credits? What are my debits out of that? Oh, this one, yeah. So another call out, policy mythology, right? Again, remember, it's not law, it's policy. It's the internal rules of the organization. They have a tendency to evolve over time, to grow, right? Here there be dragons, right? And become monstrous, and no, you can't do that because of policy. Always ask to see the policy. It should be written down. If it's not a policy. Read the policy, right? Get very familiar with it. Because the people who maybe are standing in your way, they may not have even read the policy, right? Additionally, some executive owns that policy, right? They're ultimately responsible for its contents. So if it's insane, like if it maybe made sense 40 years ago and it's still on the books today, you have someone you can sort of flag that to and like, is this right? And you're like, oh my goodness, no, let's change that or modify it or get rid of it altogether. Or maybe, yeah, it's right and you just got to live with it and you got to figure out. But yeah, policy, again, treated differently from law. This is far more malleable. You can talk to people and they'll change it. You know what I mean? It's a very different beast. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right, awesome, great. So let's wrap things up. This is also another tip I'd really encourage you to get used to, get comfortable with. Took me a long time to learn it, right? So when you're sort of trying to convince people that your idea has merit, that you've got some traction, right? From the innovator's perspective, it can seem like when you finally wear them down, like explain it to them a different way, tell them again, follow up, right? When they're finally like, okay. It can seem like they haven't done much, right? And you've done a lot and they've done very little. One, it really doesn't matter, right? Like you're still going to get further if you help, if you celebrate the wins with them. But two, they actually have done a lot, even if all they did was sort of greenlight it, all they did, right? Because they're taking a risk, right? Remember that sort of terrible demand curve I drew earlier? If you're not careful, I'll draw it again. But right, they're taking a risk just by sort of they're betting on you, right? That's sort of a big deal. And so the more comfortable you can get with standing on the podium with someone, with whom you may have clashed the whole time, right, but who ultimately was key to getting you where you wanted to go, being able to stand on the podium with them and raise their hand is not only sort of good practice, it's also very helpful as an innovator. You'll build a reputation for yourself. Not only, as being less risky, like, yeah, he's going to say crazy things to you, but just hear him out. And because remember that thing with the plaque hanging on the wall, the award we won? Yeah, we did that with him. Okay, all right? If you can make yourself less risky, it's this sort of activity that can take you very far down that path. Yeah, it's talking about how to innovate. I put here is like talking about how to have a conversation, right? Like, it's actually quite difficult to do. Like, I can get up here and tell you, like, you got to have eye contact, right? You should, speak clearly and ask questions about themselves, right? Like, try and engage them. But it's highly contextual. It's based on a lot of external factors. Overdoing any one of those ends in a bad result, right? You know what I mean? And so all the things I've sort of brought up today all need to be balanced, and you just need to practice it, right? Like, for any success I've had, there have been 10 or 20 terrible ideas that preceded it. It's also where your friends, making a good set of friends who know things that you don't and are smarter than you, can really help you out, because it keeps the circle in which that bad idea lives very small, right? Like, you say the thing, they say, don't ever say the thing again. And you say, like, right, got it. I won't ever say the thing again. Moving on. You can iterate very quickly when your space is small, right? Like, you can go fast, and you can get to those good ideas that actually might have some legs. And ultimately, sort of what I'll leave you with here is you got to take care of yourself, right? Like, you guys are sort of the next generation of technologists. You're going to go out there, again, find something to be passionate about. There's a lot of opportunities available, not just in large organizations, but certainly within large organizations. They can do a lot of good. They can move, quite literally, mountains in some cases. They need you. They need your skills. They need your brains. They need your ideas. For a lot of reasons we've sort of already talked about, they might fight you every step of the way. Doesn't mean they don't need you. But ultimately, you have options, right? Nobody has to put up with an environment that doesn't make them happy, right? With a job that's not satisfying. Obviously, there'll be up days and down days, but never before has there been so many opportunities for technology and the people who practice it. So do take care of yourself. Again, I would reference the Rebel Self-Care section of the book. It's just phenomenal. So with that, I'll take your questions.
Okay, just a quick announcement. If you have a question, if you'd be so kind as to raise your hand. We've got a couple of ambassadors. Do you have a mic already? Okay, I'll give this one to Malik. And wait until you get the mic so we can capture your question on video, okay? Thank you.
Hi, this is more of a personal question for you. So, given that you're the director of data science at,
Advanced Auto Parts.
Advanced Auto Parts.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, but
at least you didn't say AutoZone.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Remember, red, not orange.
Of course. So, what would you say separates like a data scientist who will become a director of data scientist from someone else who will typically stay as a regular data scientist? Yeah,
no, I think that's a good question. It really comes down to sort of your own personal interests. Like, what do you really get passionate about? What are you really good at? Internally, and I think this is very common across. We have sort of a managerial track and a purely technical track. But there's certainly opportunities at all the way up. Well, maybe with the exception of sort of the senior executive ranks. Yeah, I mean, again, it really comes down to sort of what you're passionate about and which sort of track. But don't get too hung up on that either, right? Like you can switch back and forth. You can be a great people manager and a great technologist. They're not mutually exclusive. I think that it comes down to, do I want to just be really good at sort of building systems, or do I want to be really good at teams that build systems? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thanks. Nice talk. Appreciate
thank you
it.
very much.
Academic departments certainly have rules, and they certainly have policies, and department heads have to deal with those. But there's another thing that we have. There's practices and behaviors that aren't written, but are still expected.
Yeah.
And you maybe could call them culture, departmental culture. It differs between departments. And I found sometimes those are harder to change than policies, because policies often have rules behind them, and you can, not rules, but arguments.
Yeah.
You can come in with different facts. But, culture is a little harder to deal with. I don't know if you've run into that.
Yeah, I think I certainly have dealt with that. Because that is a problem, and very common throughout large organizations because of, I think probably really because of the length of time they tend to have been in existence, right? It's just sort of natural to grow in that direction. And so in my own personal experience, I found that, being able to establish a shared vision for something beyond the immediate argument is a great way to get past some of those, I don't mean to downplay it, but the more sort of like those behavioral, the more tactical, like, well, that's just not the way it's done. It's like, right, but we all agree that's where we're going. And those sorts of strategies I found reasonably effective. The other way is just to not tell that person and go do it anyway. Anybody else? Oh.
What innovative risks are you currently kept up at night by at your own company?
So sort of touched on it in the intro is that, our team sits with sort of a broad mandate while we're using, cutting edge technology to optimize existing business, which is very large. We're a $10 billion company. We also have the other end of the spectrum, which is to begin to imagine and explore what our business could look like in the future. What does the market hold for us out there? So things like AI systems, things like computer vision, very much on the table. Probably can't get any more specific than that. I apologize.
As someone who has worked as like an intern at a very large organization, Oracle, and getting after a while of being there, you kind of get comfortable and feel you can identify maybe gaps. But sometimes in trying to pursue that or even convince others that there is a need, maybe you get some progress and maybe some people hear you out, but over time, again, you still have to maintain what you're usually doing. So a lot of times that innovation is, your own personal costs. So what things do you look for or, try to identify when you might be faced against a situation you might not win? And not to be like pessimistic, but like sometimes large organizations can only budge so much, and, maybe your innovation is just, so what should you look for?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think you bring up a great point. And we, back where I used to work, we would have called it like, what are you willing to fall on your sword over, right? Like, you need to be very choosy about that moment or that initiative, because you don't get too many of those in your career. And so, yeah, if you remember that the business, speaking about large organizations, the business was here yesterday, it's here today, most likely it'll be here tomorrow, right? And so the people that you're working with, dealing with, interacting with, arguing with, will still be here tomorrow, right? Like, it's not like if this one thing doesn't happen, we're all going out of business and I'll never see you again, right? So if you find yourself sort of boxed in, you just have to let it go, right? If nothing more than the sake of like, I'm probably going to come up with another idea, and I'm probably going to need this person's help again, right? And so if I make an enemy out of them now, by sort of pursuing this point that's not going to go anywhere, right? I'm closing doors for myself in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially an unsatisfying answer, I realize, but hopefully helpful.
Wasn't the most positive question, but no, thank you. Those are good points.
We good. Awesome.
I'll ask says, A, I noticed your shoes. Those Converse are All-Stars. And I saw them pop up several times in a presentation. Is there correlation?
Yeah, so, funny story. I was, so I basically, I always wear red Converse. Ever since, a million years ago, I briefed some like house representatives, an intelligence briefing, and I wore basically what I wear now, but they happen to be black Converse, and it was a great briefing. It went very well. After I walked out, one of the guys was sort of chuckling, leaned over to my boss's boss, and like, "Is he always dressed like that?" Which percolated its way through the bureaucratic ranks, right? Ultimately, remember the policy mythology? We had our own sort of set of telephone game going on, to the point where like I've offended our highest level visitors with my casual dress, and so I had to be formally reprimanded, which I was. Of course, it was also done in a very bureaucratic manner. So they said, they gave no specifics, right? They just said like, oh, what you did was bad. And here, sign this document that says you understand. And I was like, okay, great. So with a lack of specifics, I simply chose to believe that what they were offended with was the color of my black sneakers. So that night I went out and got red ones and have literally worn them ever since. It never came up again for some reason. So.
Thank you, Devin.
Yeah. Thanks very much.